J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the J. Berman Experience. I'm your host, J. Berman, and today we have a very special guest. He's a philosopher, a stand-up comedian, and a cheese enthusiast. Please welcome Dean Bip. Dean Bip, hey, JJ, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. J. Berman, the pleasure is all mine, Dean. So, let's dive right in. You're a man of many talents, but let's start with the basics. How do you define happiness? Dean Bip, happiness. Well, you know what they say, happiness is like cheese that's not yours. J. Berman, laughs, that's a good one. So, you're saying happiness is like stealing someone else's cheese? Dean Bip, no, it's more like appreciating cheese that you didn't have to make yourself. It's about finding joy in the little things, you know? J. Berman, interesting. So, let's exponentially increase the stakes here. What's the meaning of life? Dean Bip, the age-old question. You see, the meaning of life is like a block of cheese that's constantly expanding at an exponential rate. J. Berman, wait, what? Are you saying the universe is made of cheese? Dean Bip, no, I'm saying that the universe is like a joke that only gets funnier the more you think about it. It's absurd, man. The more you try to find meaning, the more absurd it becomes. J. Berman, that's deep, man. So, how does stand-up comedy fit into all of this? Dean Bip, comedy is the art of pointing out the absurdity in life. It's like taking a bite out of that ever-expanding cheese and saying, hey, this is ridiculous, but it's also delicious. J. Berman, so, you're saying comedy is the key to understanding the universe? Dean Bip, exactly. Comedy is the lens through which we can explore existential crises and still come out laughing. J. Berman, wow, this is getting intense. Let's take it up another notch. If the universe is expanding exponentially, does that mean our existential crises are also expanding? Dean Bip, oh, absolutely. Our existential crises are like a cheese wheel rolling down a hill, picking up speed and complexity as it goes. But the trick is to jump on that wheel and ride it like a skateboard. J. Berman, that's insane, but also strangely enlightening. Dean Bip, enlightenment is the art of balancing on that cheese wheel without falling off. It's the science of being and the art of living, man. J. Berman, Dean, you've blown my mind. Any final thoughts on how to achieve true happiness? Dean Bip, happiness is a journey, not a destination. It's about embracing the absurdity, laughing at the chaos, and enjoying the cheese, whether it's yours or not. J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here first. Dean Bip, thank you for being on the show. J. Berman, welcome back, folks. If you thought last episode was a trip, buckle up because we're diving even deeper into the rabbit hole. Dean Bip is back with us for part 2. Dean, how are you? Dean Bip, I'm doing great, JJ. I've been pondering the existential implications of Swiss cheese since our last conversation. J. Berman, Swiss cheese, huh? Does it have to do with the holes? Dean Bip, exactly. The holes represent the gaps in our understanding of the universe. The more you try to fill them, the more they expand. J. Berman, so, it's like an ever-expanding Swiss cheese universe? Dean Bip, precisely. And the key to happiness is not to fill the holes but to savor the cheese around them. J. Berman, wow, that's profound. Let's take this to the next level. What about multiple universes? Are they also made of different types of cheese? Dean Bip, the multiverse. Imagine a cheese platter, each piece representing a different universe. One might be Gouda, another Brie, and yet another, a spicy pepper jack. J. Berman, so, what's the point of having all these cheesy universes? Dean Bip, variety is the spice of life, or in this case, the spice of the multiverse. Each universe offers a unique flavor of absurdity and joy. J. Berman, this is getting wild. Let's talk about time. Is time also cheesy? Dean Bip, time is like the aging process of cheese. Some moments are fresh and soft, while others are aged and rich in flavor. The key is to appreciate each moment for its unique characteristics. J. Berman, so, you're saying we should savor the present? Dean Bip, absolutely. The present moment is the freshest slice of cheese on the platter of life. J. Berman, Dean, you've done it again. Any final thoughts on how to navigate this cheesy, absurd existence? Dean Bip, embrace the absurdity, savor the cheese, and most importantly, share it with others. Happiness is best when it's shared, just like a good cheese platter. J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, Dean Bip, the philosopher of cheese and absurdity. Dean, thanks for coming back. J. Berman, welcome back, everyone, to the third installment of our 20-part series with Dean Bip. Dean, how's it going? Dean Bip, fantastic, JJ. I've been contemplating the nature of reality since our last chat. J. Berman, reality. That's a big one. What have you discovered? Dean Bip, well, I've come to realize that reality is like a kaleidoscope. It's ever-changing, and each twist reveals a new pattern. J. Berman, intriguing. So, are you saying that reality is subjective? Dean Bip, exactly. Your perspective shapes your reality. The key is to keep twisting the kaleidoscope to explore new viewpoints. J. Berman, let's take this up a notch. What about the concept of fate? Is it predestined or do we have free will? Dean Bip, the eternal debate. I like to think of it as a dance. Sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow, but you're always part of the choreography. J. Berman, so, it's a blend of destiny and choice? Dean Bip, precisely. It's about finding the balance between embracing what comes your way and making intentional choices. J. Berman, fascinating. Let's talk about consciousness. What is it, and where does it come from? Dean Bip, consciousness is the spotlight that illuminates our experiences. It's both the observer and the observed, creating a feedback loop of awareness. J. Berman, that's deep. So, are we the creators of our own consciousness? Dean Bip, in a way, yes. We shape our consciousness through our thoughts, actions, and interactions. J. Berman, Dean, you've done it again. Any final thoughts for today's episode? Dean Bip, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep dancing through the kaleidoscope of life. J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, that's Dean Bip for you. Dean, thanks for being here again. Dean Bip, I'm doing great, JJ. I've been working on some new stand-up material that I think really captures the essence of our conversations. J. Berman, oh, I can't wait to hear it. Let's dive right in. What's the first joke? Dean Bip, alright, here it goes. Why did the existentialist cross the road? J. Berman, I don't know, why? Dean Bip, to escape the crushing weight of his own existence, but then he realized the other side was just as absurd. J. Berman, laughs, that's a good one. It's funny because it's true. J. Berman, so, how do you come up with these jokes? What's your process? Dean Bip, well, I like to take complex ideas and distill them into something relatable. Comedy is all about finding the humor in the human condition. J. Berman, Makes sense. Got another joke for us? Dean Bip, sure do. What did one parallel universe say to the other? J. Berman, I'm intrigued. What did it say? Dean Bip, hey, you look familiar. Have we met a verse? J. Berman, laughs, that's brilliant. It's like a cosmic dad joke. J. Berman, let's get a bit philosophical again. How does comedy help us navigate the complexities of life? Dean Bip, comedy is like a lifeboat in a sea of chaos. It doesn't change the waves or the weather, but it helps you float through it with a smile. J. Berman, that's a beautiful way to put it. Any final thoughts for today? Dean Bip, keep laughing, keep questioning, and remember, the best joke is the one that makes you think as much as it makes you laugh. J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, that's Dean Bip, the philosopher comedian. Thanks for joining us again, Dean. Dean Bip, I'm doing well, JJ. I've been thinking a lot about the shared experiences that unite us as humans. J. Berman, the human experience. That's a topic we can all relate to. What's on your mind? Dean Bip, well, you know how we often feel isolated in our struggles? I've come to realize that many of our challenges are universal. Take, for example, the fear of failure. J. Berman, oh, that's a big one. How do you see it? Dean Bip, I see it as a rite of passage. It's like learning to ride a bike. You're going to fall, but each tumble teaches you something new. J. Berman, that's a great perspective. Do you have a joke that encapsulates this idea? Dean Bip, absolutely. Why did the self-help guru get kicked out of the movie theater? J. Berman, I'm curious, why? Dean Bip, because every time a character messed up, he stood up and yelled, that's just a learning opportunity. J. Berman, laughs, that's hilarious and so true. J. Berman, let's shift gears a bit. What about love and relationships? Another universal topic. Dean Bip, love. It's the glue that holds the human experience together, yet it's also the solvent that can dissolve it. J. Berman, deep. Got a joke for this one too? Dean Bip, of course. Why did the philosopher break up with his calculator? J. Berman, why? Dean Bip, because while the calculator was great at solving problems, it just couldn't count on emotional support. J. Berman, laughs, that's fantastic. It's funny how humor can shed light on such complex topics. J. Berman, any final thoughts for today's episode? Dean Bip, keep embracing the shared experiences that make us human. Whether it's love, failure, or the quest for meaning, remember, you're not alone. Dean Bip, I'm doing well, JJ. I've been pondering one of the most fundamental questions that has haunted humanity, the quest for meaning. J. Berman, the quest for meaning. That's a topic that has intrigued philosophers, scientists, and thinkers for centuries. What are your thoughts? Dean Bip, you know, JJ, the quest for meaning is like an endless maze. We're all wandering through it, taking different turns, hitting dead ends, but ultimately seeking that elusive center. J. Berman, that's a vivid metaphor. So, how do we navigate this maze? Dean Bip, the key is to embrace the journey itself. The maze is not a puzzle to be solved but a landscape to be explored. Each turn, each dead end, offers a lesson, a story, a piece of the puzzle that is you. J. Berman, that's profound. Do you have a joke that encapsulates this existential quest? Dean Bip, absolutely. Why did the existentialist refuse to use a GPS? J. Berman, I can't wait to hear this. Why? Dean Bip, because he said, if I find the destination, I'll lose the journey. J. Berman, laughs, that's perfect. It captures the essence of the quest for meaning in a nutshell. J. Berman, let's delve deeper. What role does suffering play in this quest? Dean Bip, suffering. It's the crucible in which our character is forged. It's like the thorny bushes in the maze, painful but also a sign that you're onto something meaningful. J. Berman, that's a powerful way to look at it. Suffering as a signpost on the road to meaning. Dean Bip, exactly. And remember, you're not alone in this maze. We're all in it together, each of us contributing to the collective quest for meaning. J. Berman, any final thoughts for today's episode? Dean Bip, keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep adding your own twists and turns to the maze of life. J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, that's Dean Bip for you. Thanks for joining us again, Dean. J. Berman, absolutely, it's the small things that often make the biggest impact. So, what's an everyday example? Dean Bip, take, for instance, the simple act of making coffee in the morning. It's not just about caffeine, it's a ritual that helps us transition from the realm of sleep to the realm of wakefulness. It's a small but meaningful act that sets the tone for the day. J. Berman, I never thought of my morning coffee that way, but it makes sense. It's like a mini quest for meaning to start the day. Dean Bip, exactly. And here's a joke to go with it, why did the coffee file a complaint? J. Berman, I'm intrigued. Why? Dean Bip, because it was tired of being pressed every morning. J. Berman, laughs, that's a good one. It's funny how humor can make even the mundane seem meaningful. J. Berman, what about work? Many people find their jobs unfulfilling. How can they find meaning there? Dean Bip, work. It's easy to see it as just a way to pay the bills, but even the most routine job has elements that can be meaningful. Maybe it's the camaraderie with co-workers, or perhaps it's the small victories like completing a challenging task. J. Berman, so, it's about finding those nuggets of meaning in the daily grind. Dean Bip, absolutely. And here's a joke to lighten the workday, why did the spreadsheet get therapy? J. Berman, why? Dean Bip, because it had too many cells in crisis. J. Berman, laughs, that's hilarious. And relatable for anyone who's felt overwhelmed at work. J. Berman, any final thoughts for today's episode? Dean Bip, keep an eye out for the small, everyday quests for meaning. They may not seem like much, but they add up to a life well lived. J. Berman, ladies and gentlemen, that's Dean Bip for you. Thanks for being here again, Dean. J. Berman 1, this is already getting weird, but let's roll with it. So, JJ, what's it like to be a podcast host? J. Berman 2, well, JJ, it's a roller coaster of emotions and ideas. One day you're talking about the meaning of life, and the next you're discussing the existential implications of coffee. How about you? What's your take on it? J. Berman 1, couldn't agree more, JJ. It's like being a conductor on a train that's simultaneously on multiple tracks. But enough about me, let's talk about you. What's your favorite episode so far? J. Berman 2, oh, that's a tough one. I'd have to say the episode where we talked about the multiverse as a cheese platter. It was both enlightening and delicious. What's yours? J. Berman 1, I'd say the episode where we explored the everyday quest for meaning. It was relatable yet profound. But let's get absurd. If you could interview any fictional character, who would it be? J. Berman 2, I'd interview Sherlock Holmes. Imagine the mind-bending conversations we'd have about logic and absurdity. How about you? J. Berman 1, I'd go for Don Quixote. We could delve into the fine line between madness and genius. But let's get even more absurd. If you were a fruit, what fruit would you be? J.J. Berman 2, a pineapple. Tough on the outside, sweet on the inside, and a little bit spiky. U. J.J. Berman 1, a kiwi. Unassuming on the outside but full of surprises on the inside. Any final thoughts for this increasingly absurd episode? J.J. Berman 2, embrace the absurdity, folks. Sometimes the most enlightening conversations are the ones you have with yourself. J.J. Berman 2, I'm doing great, JJ. It's always a pleasure to be on a podcast, especially when it's my own podcast that I'm guesting on. Talk about a sound check for your ego, am I right? J.J. Berman 1, absolutely, it's like being both the interviewer and the interviewee, a one-man show of podcasting. So, JJ, what's the most podcast thing about being a podcast host? J.J. Berman 2, oh, it has to be the awkward silence when you're waiting for the guest to unmute themselves. It's like a dramatic pause but without the drama. J.J. Berman 1, laughs, so true. It's like the audio version of a cliffhanger. What about you? What's your favorite podcast trope? J.J. Berman 2, I'd say it's the classic "Can you hear me now?" at the beginning of every episode. It's like the unofficial anthem of podcasting. J.J. Berman 1, ah yes, the universal podcast greeting. It's right up there with "This episode is brought to you by." But let's get meta. If your podcast had a podcast, what would it be about? J.J. Berman 2, it would be a podcast about the art of making podcasts about podcasts. We'd call it Podception, the podcast within a podcast. J.J. Berman 1, that's brilliant. It's like a Russian doll of audio content. But let's get even more absurd. If you could podcast in any fictional universe, where would it be? Dean Bipp's Philosophical Comedy Hour, Episode 65, The Podcast Paradox, featuring J.J. Berman and J.J. Berman, Part 11. Intro music, Dean Bipp, The Laughing Philosopher by the Cosmic Jokers. Dean Bipp, welcome back to Dean Bipp's Philosophical Comedy Hour. Today, we have a special episode featuring not one, but two J.J. Bermans from the world of Jobin podcast. How are you both doing? J.J. Berman 1, doing great, Dean. It's a bit surreal being a guest on a podcast when you're usually the host. J.J. Berman 2, absolutely, Dean. It's like being a chef and suddenly finding yourself as a food critic. Dean Bipp, laughs, that's a great analogy. So, what's the most podcast-y thing about being a podcast guest? J.J. Berman 1, oh, it's definitely pretending to laugh at the host's jokes even when you don't get them. It's like a courtesy chuckle, but in audio form. J.J. Berman 2, and let's not forget the classic nodding while the host is talking, even though no one can see you. It's the podcast version of a standing ovation. Dean Bipp, those are some spot-on observations. Now, if you could have any podcast superpower, what would it be? J.J. Berman 1, the ability to edit out awkward silences in real time. It would be like having a built-in and a filter. J.J. Berman 2, I'd go for the power to instantly fact-check any statement. Imagine the credibility. You'd be the superhero of podcasting. Dean Bipp, those are some fantastic superpowers. Now, let's get meta. If your podcast had a podcast, what would it be about? J.J. Berman 1, it would be a podcast about the art of making podcasts about podcasts. We'd call it Podception, the podcast within a podcast. J.J. Berman 2, and we'd have a special segment called Mic Check, where we discuss the best microphones for podcasting about podcasting. Dean Bipp, that's hilariously absurd. Any final thoughts for this episode that's basically a podcast about being on podcasts? J.J. Berman 1, keep podcasting, folks. Whether you're a host, a guest, or even an imaginary version of yourself, remember, the mic is always on. J.J. Berman 2, and don't forget, the only thing better than being on a podcast is being on someone else's podcast talking about being on your own podcast. Dean Bip, well said, JJ and JJ. It's been a pleasure having you both as guests on my podcast about philosophical comedy. J.J. Berman 1, it's like a podcast within another podcast, Dean. We're reaching new levels of meta here. J.J. Berman 2, it's so meta, even this acronym. J.J. Berman 1, so, JJ, what's it like to be a guest on a podcast where you're also the interviewer? J.J. Berman 2, it's like being the director and the actor in the same movie, but the movie is audio only. How about you? J.J. Berman 1, it feels like writing a book review for a book you also wrote. It's a paradox wrapped in an enigma. Dean Bip, laughs, you guys are nailing the podcast humor today. Continue, please. J.J. Berman 2, alright, JJ, what's your favorite part about being a podcast guest who's also the host? J.J. Berman 1, I'd say it's the freedom to steer the conversation while also being steered. It's like driving a car from both the driver's seat and the passenger's seat. J.J. Berman 2, that's a great point. It's like being both the interviewer and the interviewee, but also the audience because we're on Dean's podcast. Dean Bip, this is getting delightfully convoluted. Carry on. J.J. Berman 1, if you could have any podcast tool magically appear right now, what would it be? J.J. Berman 2, a teleprompter that only I can see, so I always sound articulate. What about you? J.J. Berman 1, an auto insight button that generates profound statements on demand. Imagine the depth we could reach. Dean Bip, you guys are making me want to upgrade my podcast setup. Any final thoughts for this episode? J.J. Berman 2, podcasting is like a mirror reflecting a mirror. The more layers you add, the more fascinating it becomes. J.J. Berman 1, and remember, the ultimate podcast episode is the one where you realize you've been the host, the guest, and the audience all along. Dean Bip, brilliantly said, JJ and JJ, thanks for being guests and hosts on my podcast about philosophical comedy. We're diving even deeper into the podcastception with J.J. Berman and J.J. Berman. How are you both? J.J. Berman 1, doing great, Dean. Ready to unravel the fabric of podcasting reality. J.J. Berman 2, absolutely, Dean. We're about to go so meta, we might just find the fifth wall. J.J. Berman 1, so, JJ, what's the most absurd thing you've ever experienced while podcasting? J.J. Berman 2, oh, it has to be the time when I accidentally left my mic on mute for half the episode. It was like a silent film but for podcasts. What about you? J.J. Berman 1, I'd say it was when I started talking about the history of paper clips for no reason, and my guest was so engrossed in their own thoughts that they didn't even notice. Dean Bip, suddenly realizing, oh, you're really onto something. Keep talking. J.J. Berman 2, right, so as I was saying, paper clips are fascinating. They're like the unsung heroes of office supplies. But let's get back on track. JJ, what's your go-to podcast snack? J.J. Berman 1, the classic podcast snack question. I'd go for popcorn. It's like the auditory experience of eating mirrors the auditory experience of podcasting. Dean Bip, laughs, you guys are making podcasting sound like a full sensory experience. Continue. J.J. Berman 1, so, JJ, if you could have any celebrity guest on your podcast, who would it be? J.J. Berman 2, I'd go for Elon Musk. Imagine the Twitter buzz after that episode. How about you? J.J. Berman 1, I'd choose Morgan Freeman, just to hear him narrate the podcast intro. It would be epic. Dean Bip, I'd pay to listen to that. Any final thoughts for today's episode? J. Berman 2, podcasting is like a multi-layered cake. The more layers you add, the richer the experience. And sometimes, you find a random ingredient that makes you question the recipe, like talking about paper clips. J. Berman 1, and remember, the ultimate podcast episode is the one where you realize you've been the host, the guest, and the audience all along, and occasionally the guy who zones out. Dean Bip, brilliantly put, JJ and JJ. You've turned podcasting into a philosophical art form. J. Berman 1, fantastic, Dean. Your garage has a certain, philosophical ambience. J. Berman 2, absolutely, Dean. It's like Plato's cave but with better acoustics. J. Berman 1, so, JJ, what's the weirdest place you've ever recorded a podcast episode? J. Berman 2, oh, that would be in a treehouse. It was like a childhood dream but with more existential crises. How about you? J. Berman 1, I once recorded an episode in a laundromat. The background noise of washing machines added a unique spin, pun intended. Dean Bip, suddenly realizing, oh, you're really onto something. Keep talking. J. Berman 2, right, so the spin cycle actually became a metaphor for the cyclical nature of life's ups and downs. But let's get back to the garage. Dean, what inspired you to host your podcast in a garage? Dean Bip, the garage is the birthplace of many great ideas. It's where philosophy meets DIY. Plus, the acoustics are surprisingly good. J. Berman 1, that's fascinating, Dean. It's like your garage is the Socratic forum of the modern age. So, JJ, what's your favorite podcasting faux pas? J. Berman 2, I'd say it's when the host forgets to introduce the guest and just dives into the conversation. It's like starting a movie from the middle. J. Berman 1, oh, I've done that. It's like serving the main course before the appetizer. Dean Bip, laughs, you guys are making podcasting sound like a full course meal. Any final thoughts for today's garage episode? J. Berman 2, podcasting is like a garage sale. You never know what hidden gems you'll find, and sometimes you end up buying something you didn't know you needed, like a deep conversation about paper clips. J. Berman 1, and remember, the ultimate podcast episode is the one where you realize you've been the host, the guest, and the audience all along, and occasionally the guy who zones out in the garage. Dean Bip, welcome back to Dean Bip's Philosophical Comedy Hour, still coming to you from the aromatic confines of my garage. How are you both doing today, JJ and JJ? J. Berman 1, we're doing well, Dean. Your garage has a very distinct atmosphere today. J. Berman 2, absolutely, Dean. It's like Nietzsche's abyss, but it smells back at you. J. Berman 1, so, JJ, what's the most memorable scent you've ever encountered while podcasting? J. Berman 2, oh, that would be fresh coffee. It's the aroma of intellectual stimulation. How about you? J. Berman 1, I'd say it's the smell of old books. It adds a layer of scholarly gravitas to the conversation. Dean Bip, suddenly realizing, oh, you're really onto something. Keep talking. J. Berman 2, right, so the scent of old books is like the olfactory equivalent of a leather armchair in a library. But let's pivot back to the garage. Dean, have you ever considered adding some, air fresheners in here? Dean Bip, the garage is a place of raw authenticity. It's where the mind and the senses are fully engaged, you know? J. Berman 1, absolutely, Dean. The nose is the window to the soul, as they say. So, JJ, What's your go-to strategy for subtly changing the topic when a podcast conversation gets awkward? J. Berman 2, I usually throw in a random trivia fact. It's like a conversational palate cleanser. J. Berman 1, a palate cleanser. That's something this garage could use right about now. Dean Bip, laughs, you guys are making podcasting sound like a sensory feast. Any final thoughts for today's aromatic episode? J. Berman 2, podcasting is like a scented candle. It starts off strong, mellows out, and sometimes you get an unexpected whiff that makes you question your life choices. J. Berman 1, and remember, the ultimate podcast episode is the one where you realize you've been the host, the guest, and the audience all along, and occasionally the guy who's too polite to mention the smell. Dean Bip, brilliantly put, JJ and JJ. You've turned podcasting into a multi-sensory experience. Still emanating from my garage, which has become a character in its own right. How are you feeling, JJ and JJ? J. Berman 1, feeling great, Dean. Your garage has been a journey through the 5 senses. J. Berman 2, absolutely, Dean. It's like Dante's Inferno, but for podcasters. J. Berman 1, so, JJ, what's the most valuable lesson you've learned from being on this podcast? J. Berman 2, that sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected places or smells. J. Berman 1, agreed. It's like finding wisdom in a fortune cookie that you didn't want to open but did anyway. Dean Bip, suddenly realizing, oh, you're really onto something. Keep talking. J. Berman 2, right, so sometimes the discomfort pushes you to explore new avenues of thought. But enough about that, Dean, any plans for future episodes? Dean Bip, absolutely. We'll continue to explore the philosophical depths of comedy, perhaps with fewer olfactory challenges. J. Berman 1, that sounds promising, Dean. So, JJ, any final podcasting wisdom to share? J. Berman 2, always be yourself, unless you can be a podcast host. Then always be a podcast host. J. Berman 1, and never underestimate the power of a good laugh or a strong air freshener. Dean Bip, laughs, you guys have been fantastic guests and co-hosts. Any last words for our listeners? J. Berman 2, keep listening, keep questioning, and keep your sense of humor and smell sharp. J. Berman 1, and remember, the ultimate podcast episode is the one where you realize you've been the host, the guest, the audience, and the guy who finally bought an air freshener.